There was a lot of excitement in the telepathic buzz of the Triskus ambassadorial corps as the human ship drew close. Even the charge d'affaires was broadcasting more than a bit of excitement, and normally he liked to maintain an air of utter unflappability. Still, who could blame him? The humans were really excited. First off, it seemed they might be mentally compatible with Triskus psychology. That level of compatibility was rare, not just for the Triskus, but for any race. In fact, it was more common for two species to be so different they couldn't even agree on the basic facts of the universe, find names for all of each other's emotions, or agree on absolutely basic standards of behavior and morality. Trade between species could exist, but it was carried out by trained and closely supervised personnel. For the most part, that was as close as two races could get. Of course, some worlds existed where different species mingled, but they typically managed that by simply foregoing all laws. The resultant societies never lasted long. They become havens for drug production, child sex slavery, silverware misuse, or clock manufacture, and eventually, a more powerful polity would glass them. That was a shame. When two species could get along well enough to work or even live side by side, they reaped enormous benefits. To start, they doubled their territory and military might overnight. Longer term, there were tremendous economic and scientific rewards as the different aptitudes of the races meshed. That was why the ambassadorial corps ended up acting like a bunch of deranged matchmakers, forever searching for the one. To overextend that metaphor, matching with the humans would be like finding a real love connection with a beautiful heiress who had a great sense of humor. Human technology was just incredible. They were one of the races that could build things of mind-boggling complexity. The ship the ambassadorial corps was meeting was a good example. It contained weapons, conference rooms, crew rec facilities, and much more. The Triskus couldn't even translate the language of most races that built ships like that. Crumjd was distracted from that last thought by the appearance of the objects of his professional affection, walking through the semi-permanent passage that connected the Crumjd and human ships while negotiations were ongoing. The young engineer didn't broadcast his first emotion upon seeing them. They definitely were only like a beautiful heiress metaphorically. Crumjd had known they were bipedal and bilaterally symmetrical. He'd even seen pictures and video of them, but in person, it just looked wrong. They were so stretched out and unstable looking. If one of them stopped balancing for even an instant, they'd surely collapse instantly. Not that it seemed to bother them. Crumjd had assumed they'd move by sliding their feet forward. But no, they had a stride similar to Triskus, lifting a foot entirely off the ground to move it. In fact, it didn't stop there. They seemed quite content to take both feet off the ground and just jump or fall forward. For a moment, Crumjd tried to work out the calculus of it, but that was a losing proposition. Broadly speaking, their limbs were first-class levers, and they moved a bit like an inverted pendulum, but it was all too irregular. They moved their arms and legs and even centers of mass as they walked, throwing off the balance of their movement. Or rather, it would have thrown off that balance, but they shifted by tiny increments so smoothly that they never wavered. He couldn't keep up with it all, and for the first time, Crumjd wondered if he'd been handed an impossible task. He was supposed to figure out how they built the mighty ships. He was wondering if they did it by being way smarter than the Triskus. "It doesn't affect the weapons!" Crumjd was no expert in human vocal patterns, but even his limited training said the engineer he was talking to was angry. Well, that was fine. Crumjd was also pissed. When he'd stepped aboard the ship, he'd been given a small device to translate his telepathic broadcasts to something a human could understand. At the moment, it hung dull and unlit at his breast. Or rather, it glowed in a portion of the near-infrared that humans could see, but Triskus couldn't. That color meant anger to the humans. "It's an electrical system! Of course it has an impact on your other electrical systems!" "The weapons are isolated!" "They have their own power plants, then?" "What? No! I mean, they have backups, but I already showed you the annihilation generator. It runs everything." "Then what do your words mean? If they are interconnected," he meshed his phalanges, "then they affect one another." He wiggled some of the phalanges, but not others. They all moved. The telepathy converter had shifted to a deep green. Confusion. "Okay, yes, sure, they're linked after a fashion. I mean, I guess a big enough shock to the third cargo bay auxiliary lighting could, hypothetically, propagate to the weapons system. But what you're talking about..." The human trailed off. His expression now looked exactly like the pre-mission examples of confusion. Crumjd broadcast an emotion that his translator couldn't handle, causing it to ripple in a quick rainbow pattern. On the one plate, it was astounding to be moving in such mental sync with such an alien being. But at the balancing plate, the humans seemed utterly mad. Or at least their engineers were. He hadn't dealt with the cooks or lawyers. Apparently, the cooks and lawyers were great. The cooks had worked with the medical and biological science officers of both sides, and come up with foods everyone could eat, blended out of the traditional ingredients of both races. The lawyers, meanwhile, were pounding out a simple framework of law that would allow trade and military support almost instantly, while simultaneously holding the potential to extend to full joint colonization or an exchange of citizens. Cricri looked about during the weekly meeting of his diplomatic mission, and it made him resentful being the only black mark in the otherwise glowing field of shiny progress, when the chargé d'affaires broadcast inquiry and asked, "And engineering?"
"The humans they are friendly, happy to answer all questions, quite comfortable to interact with. I feel I'm already starting to learn their methods of nonverbal communication. I feel there's nothing that should hold up our relations."
"Yes, but their technology." Cricri held back from broadcasting his frustration for a long moment, before deciding he might as well be honest, and letting it go in a rush that made everyone else at the meeting team lean away from him.
"They're nuts! I don't know if it's some manner of obfuscation or something deeper, but they can't seem to answer any question about how their technology works. I mean, they can tell me the concept easily enough, but if I try to get interactions or interrelations, they spout madness. I asked, for example, how the forward armor impacts the integrity of the main conference room, and the humans just looked at me as though my words didn't translate."
Cricri drew a deep breath and continued.
"However, he did understand the words because he said what they always say. It doesn't, which is crazy because that conference room is the biggest void in their ship, and the armor is the heaviest part of the ship, and it's nearly as far away as you can get from the main thrusters. The combination of factors must be the biggest structural issue on the whole ship."
"I presume you explained that."
"I shouldn't have had to. It's very basic engineering. Still, I pointed it out and asked again, but he just talked about load-bearing structures and whatnot, and how they were still strong enough with or without the room. It's as though you shouldn't even think about a great whacking void in the middle of your ship when designing all of that."
The chargé d'affaires emitted a mild consternation and disappointment. "Still, you say it's not an issue. Let us know if it becomes one." Later, Cricri held his telepathic translator up to his guide. Perhaps the human could describe it without resorting to nonsense.
"Tell me, how does this work then?"
It went blue, reflecting the curiosity he was sending out. "Okay, sure, that's really simple. Your telepathy isn't anything terribly complex. You just broadcast your emotional state in low-frequency, amplitude-modulated radio waves. So that," he gestured at the device, "is basically an antenna, a programmable chip, and a screen hooked together. That's simple. It practically frequency shifts your sendings without an intermediary."
Yes, but more specifically, tell me about the battery, the antenna, the screen."
The human shrugged. That was a gesture the Triskis couldn't translate. It almost seemed to herald their madness. Something along the lines of, "That's a detail I will disregard for no reason I intend to explain." And indeed, the human answered, "They're standard."
"How can that be? You've only built 20 or so of the things. Are you telling me you already have them standardized?"
No, of course not. They're standard for other things. I think the antenna is from a mobile, the battery is a standard flash rechargeable solid-state electrolyte, the screen is thin-film OLED normally sold for disposable displays, the antenna hooks up to the display and the battery with a programmable board normally sold to hobbyists. We 3D printed the plastic parts.
"You're saying none of the major parts were designed to work together?"
The man shrugged. Cricri had to suppress the urge to punch him. "Not specifically," the man answered at length. "In a general way, they are."
"That makes no sense! Here!"
Cricri opened the battery compartment and eyed the writing on the back of the battery.
"If I'm reading your language correctly, this is a 6.8-volt, 4200 milliamp-hour battery. Are you saying the board takes 6.8 volts of power and the ideal duty cycle for the screens was structured around 4200 milliamp hours?"
The board was a little lower power. If I recall correctly, we put in a resistor, and 4200 is actually a bit much for the screens. It probably hasn't run low on you yet, and it's kind of heavy.
"All right. So these things perform rather poorly as a system, but you just sort of slapped them together,"
Cricri said in triumph. "Here now, they work well enough." The human sounded offended. Cricri was rather proud of himself for picking that up from the being's tone. He also didn't blame him. No engineer wanted to have their work insulted, and this one knew enough of the details of the emotional translators that Cree suspected he had been on the design of the device. He was quick to soothe.
No, I agree. They're quite ingenious, and it's a marvelous way to solve an engineering problem. It's just...
Cree looked at his translator to see a new color suffused as he broadcast a pulse of fear.
I'm beginning to believe you might have built your whole ship this way.
What, with standard batteries, resistors, and such? How else would you build a ship? Those parts are... The human trailed off looking for a metaphor, which he apparently found. They're like parts of the body.
What? How?
Well, okay, you got a hand. The human looked at Cree's hand, which admittedly wasn't terribly similar to the human's from a morphological perspective. A sort of hand, anyway. Now, when you want to pick something up, you don't estimate its weight, estimate just how much force it'll take to propel your hand over to it, calculate what it will take to pull your hand back with the object, figure out what the weight and effort will do to your body as a whole, and how much oxygen you'll burn by picking it up, and then start breathing heavy if you're going to need more air. You use your hand to pick the thing up, and everything else handles itself. Cree was silent for a long time. He blinked 7 times, keeping his eyes lubricated. He took 27 breaths, and his heart beat 35 times. He broadcast confusion, and it made the translator around his neck glow a perfect green. At length, he stated,
"That is exactly what I do."
The human engineer had hurried them both to the medbay in an attempt to find the ship's doctor while he explained the concepts he only half understood. Humans, it turned out, had 2 forms of muscle, 2 nervous systems, and different parts of the brain to control different parts of the body. Even what they did control, they barely thought about. They didn't do any calculus to move, or consciously estimate the weights of things they wanted to move beyond light and heavy. Humans were practically symbiotes in their own bodies, and it was deeply creepy.
So wait, you can close your eyelid intentionally, but when you blink you don't think about it?
Cree asked the doctor.
God, well now I'm going to think about it for the next few minutes.
The engineer's complaint illuminated exactly nothing. Yes, the doctor answered. Then he asked a question of his own. You still control basic processes when you sleep?
Of course!
Their breathing and heartbeat were all Triscus really experienced when they were asleep, and that the slow automatic sifting of memories and experience from the previous day. Cree broadcast a pulse of discomfort at the idea of sleeping without that connection to the physical world. How would one distinguish between their distorted memories and reality? But surely you have automatic reactions. Cree pulsed an affirmative.
Chemical things. I don't explicitly control the production of enzymes and acids in my digestive system. They're produced by glands that react to the presence or absence of sugars and whatnot. Electrically signaled things, those I must think about.
Wait, the engineer said, raising his voice to signal excitement. Cree wondered if he even considered his tone before adopting it. If you have to think about all that stuff all the time, like the interactions between your heart and your legs and your balance and everything, is that why you were always bugging me about crazy interactions in unrelated ship systems?
They are not...
Yeah, I get that. But to us, they sort of are. I mean, your ankle bone is connected to your shin bone and all that, but we don't really think about that all the time, and that's how we build our ships, but you do think about it. Cree considered, then bobbed his head in a way he hoped the human would interpret as a nod.
Just so, I suppose. We do break big problems into smaller parts, but not so compulsively as you.
And seeing it all as a system, that's what makes your tiny ship so insanely performant and durable. We thought you had tech or tricks we didn't, but you probably just work out every last interaction.
And you understand the mad labyrinths you pile up.
The human let out a long, low whistle. It was some sort of emotional expression, presumably a potent one, but not one Cree had been trained in. The human clarified something by speaking. Think about what we could do together. I bet your species could work bugs that we'd never see out of designs, or you could suggest some truly impressive improvements. Cree did his nod-like thing again.
You would see your way around problems that would block us for years, or even cause a project to be abandoned. We couldn't have built the telepathic translators so quickly.
Cree elevated his heart rate and breathing to oxygenate the compounds rushing into his blood as his excitement triggered a fight-or-flight response. A union between species would be every bit as extraordinary as the diplomatic corps had dreamed. And then some.